finished just before.
Friend, very good to have you with us. I nearly said to see you. James, nice to see you. I'm so one day I won't stumble over that.
No, indeed. Well, it's very nice to see you, Ian, and good to be here again. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. James, where are we in the lectionary?
We are at the fourth Sunday of Epiphany, and we have a passage, Mark 1:21 to 28.
Yeah.
Now, some people might not be keeping the fourth Sunday of Epiphany as the fourth Sunday of Epiphany because they might keep it as the presentation of Christ in the temple. That is a feast which you can transfer to that Sunday.
That is true. But what should they do if they're doing that?
They should probably look at your YouTube channel and see if we've got anything on it, which we have.
Which we have. I'm sure we have.
Yeah.
So, okay. I'll put a link below then, so
Sure.
people can link to that if they want to.
Sure. But we're going to look at Mark 1:21 to 28 today. So
yeah, we are. And there'll be, of course, a linked written article as well for both of these. So if people need it. So it's great. But having talked about what people should do, there's 4 other things we love them to do as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there are. We'd love you to click like the videos. We'd love you to subscribe to the channel, which would be very
subscribe button.
Very good.
We're down here. Yep.
Yeah. We'd love you to share on the social media.
On the social media, we do.
Yeah.
Whatever the social media is that you use.
Yes. And we would love you to comment wherever is convenient for you. Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, the last couple of weeks, we've had a little bit of...
We've had quite a few comments. Yeah, it's been great.
Which is a big discussion. And also, of course, there's often more extended comment, either on the related blog article, but also on the social media as well, particularly on Facebook. So,
indeed. Yeah.
One of the nice things about Facebook, I know that Twitter and there's TikTok and there's Instagram and all those other things, but the one nice thing about Facebook for us oldies is that you can actually have a decent conversation and a thread and an extended discussion about it. So, which is always good. Good. Now, tell us where we are then. So we're in Mark 1:21 to 28.
Yeah, because we're in the year of Mark. Yeah,
we are. Now, just the very first thing, and I know we talked about this before, but I'm sure, dear viewers, you won't be bored with it again. I think it's really fascinating, again, switching particularly from the fourth gospel into the first, Matthew, Mark, the second gospel. I said the first gospel there. Almost certainly the first gospel in terms of when it was written, for those who agree with Mark and priority. And at one level, I sort of want to contrast the intensity of the fourth gospel with Mark, but actually Mark has its own intensity. But it is fascinating, isn't it, to sense the different kind of intensity in that. I suppose I was thinking, just preparing for this, how do you describe the difference? And I suppose I'd characterize it by saying that in the fourth gospel, we have an intensity of theological significance and sort of overflow. You get all these words with double meaning. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was just really struck by Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him. Now, of course, you'd say, well, he was walking towards him, but actually, he was actually spiritually coming towards him. There's a discipleship dimension. So you have that kind of intensity in the fourth gospel. But here in Mark, we have a different kind of intensity, don't we? A kind of intensity of action.
We do very much so. And of course, we have this sort of first day, this kind of opening day of Jesus' ministry in Mark's gospel, where so much happens. It's just absolutely breathtaking. It's rapid. It's dynamic. And you kind of get to somewhere in, the end of chapter 1 and you think, wow, did all that happen just suddenly like that in one day? Kind of, but it does give a sense of the absolute, bombshell really of Jesus' ministry arriving in this region and transforming lives and causing conflict and all sorts of things that arise from it. From this announcement that the kingdom of God is near.
Indeed. It's disruptive.
It is utterly disruptive, yeah.
Well, I think this is one of the things I'd like to come back to, that it's disruptive in one sense, but not disruptive in another sense. Because, of course, there's a question of continuity with the Old Testament, which we'll come on to. I don't want to jump ahead on that. But when you mentioned that, that's really interesting. You talk about this one day. Well, of course, actually, what you're pointing out is that this typical day in the life of Jesus here in Mark is an artifice. It is a creation of the gospel writer in the way that he's built this narrative. And again, it's a bit of a reminder to us, isn't it, that on the one hand, all 4 gospels, even though they differ from one another, they're actually, in terms of the kind of writing they are, sit quite closely together when you compare them with other literature. And what they sit within, they meet the kind of expectations that a first century historian would have had in terms of how they treat the subject. So on the one hand, and they've got lots of what we might call reality effects, and we constantly note these things. So on the one hand, we've got the Gospels which look historically plausible
Mm.
on the one hand. On the other hand, each gospel writer has clearly constructed their narrative to make particular points about this Jesus.
Yes. And I think in this particular case with Mark, you've got this busy day, but in a sense, the gospel writer is simply telling us these are the kinds of things that happen when Jesus is around. These are the things that he did. And then the rest of the gospel, similar things happen. Similar things unfold. But we've already been given this basic flavor of the kind of ministry that Jesus has. And so we're not really, we shouldn't be surprised at the things that are to come. So we understand the, things like the conflict with the power of darkness. We understand the extraordinary reaction of the crowds, the calling of people, or all those sorts of things, healings and so on as well, later in chapter 1. So you get this kind of flavor, don't you, of what the kingdom of God is about and what Jesus is going to, how he's going to inaugurate it, how he's going to bring it in.
And again, fascinating to note, in these quite different readings that we've had over these 4 weeks in Epiphany, again, there is the sense of this epiphania. This is the revelation of who Jesus is, though in quite distinct ways. So, with the wedding at Cana, this was the first sign, and he revealed his glory. So again, you get that kind of epiphany type language. So although we are a bit critical sometimes of the lectionary, I think this has actually been quite an interesting selection of readings for the season.
It absolutely, yeah. And I think this one is perhaps a little bit more subtle, but it doesn't tell us it's a revelation, but of course it absolutely is a revelation of who Jesus is. Yeah.
Just on that question of relation to the other Gospels, I mean, the last thing to observe, which is something really fascinating about this passage, is that this is the only passage which occurs in Mark and in Luke, but not in Matthew.
Yes. That is really interesting, isn't it? And
that Luke and Mark use the passage in a slightly different way.
Yes, they do, because for Luke is the back end of chapter 4, where Jesus has already spoken his manifesto of release for the captives and so on, and here this is the articulation of that, really, isn't it? The practical outworking of it. Whereas for Mark, it's something which is absolutely characteristic of Jesus' ministry right from the start. This authority that he has. So but it's interesting that Luke. The language in Luke, of the way that Luke tells this story, is almost identical to Mark. It's very, very close.
Yes, isn't that fascinating? Yeah, it is. And I'm tempted to say, let's spend a bit of time talking about the word "and."
Yeah. Yes, how exciting.
Well, I know it sounds odd, but and again, folks, this is the advantage. If you are able just to have enough Greek, not to be fluent or to have a conversation and an audio dinner in Greek necessarily when you go on holiday, but enough just to read the passage in Greek in parallel with an English translation, for example, because then you do get the flavor. I know that there's been a few attempts at translations, particular translations. Scott McKnight has done one recently to try and have what they might call a more literal, a translation that actually shows you the style of the individual writers, which I think is very difficult to do. But and again, we've mentioned this in the past, that Mark has this practice of what we call parataxis. So he says, and this, and this, and this. Para just meaning putting things alongside one another. So you just simply get this stream of events, which creates a very particular sense of driving urgency in the narrative. But of course, that is the way that Mark structures his style and grammar to reflect the sense of driving urgency of Jesus's ministry.
Yeah.
Whereas, of course, Luke tends to use hypertaxis, where he has more complex sentence structures and says, having done this, before he did this, then this happened. Whereas actually, as you mentioned, that here, in this account in Luke 4, actually matches very closely to the structure of Mark's narrative, which I suppose is, if you're interested in that, is evidence that Luke probably did have Mark's gospel in front of him.
Yes. And in fact, in turning to the passage itself in front of us, I mean, one of the things that Mark, one of the devices that Mark uses to give us this dynamic is this use of the phrase kai euthus, and suddenly, or and immediately, or and next, which is quite interesting here, because I was checking out some of the English translations of this, and in the first verse of our in 121, the euthus is not translated very obviously. The New RSV, NIV, it's rather hidden away. Completely hidden away. It is translated in the ESV and the King James Version, interestingly.
Yes, it is. But the reason why is because the ESV is trying to emulate some of the elements of the King James Version.
Exactly. But you wouldn't kind of I mean, it's difficult. It's not always straightforward to translate this word, this immediately, suddenly, or and next, and but nevertheless, it is lost to this English, and it's not. It's a phrase that occurs a couple of times in this single passage.
Yes.
So, but that dynamism of it is which Mark uses it to create this dynamism, I think.
It does. And I love the fact that in the King James Version, the Authorized Version, it says, and straightway on the Sabbath day. And of course, he uses straightway as the translation. And I just love the connection back. I think it's just Mark being quite amusing, where John the Baptist has come to make a straight way for the Lord. Ha ha, and then straightway Jesus comes.
Yes,
and it is that connection in the Greek in Greek. So
yeah, very good. Yeah.
One other thing to notice, though, about this, and again, I commented this a bit on the blog, is that so on the one hand, it creates a dynamism. On the other hand, it gives us some clues into the connection between the relationship between Luke and Mark. But actually, the other thing it does, and I'm sure that this is deliberate, this is what Mark is doing, is that saying and imitates, this is in Greek, because in Greece, imitates the Hebrew of the Old Testament, where you get so folks, if you've done Hebrew at all, you'll come across the Vav consecutive, or sometimes called the Vav conversive now, because when you use the Kal, when you well let's not get into technical, when you use a normal verb in Hebrew to turn it into a narrative past, you put the Vav consecutive on the front of it. And again, most modern translations would simply just translate it as, and this happened, this happened, this happened. The Authorized Version says, and it came to pass that. So you get that kind of artifice. And there is a sense here where Mark is writing in a way which will sound to his readers to remind them of the Old Testament.
Yeah. So it sounds like biblical literature, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. There we go. And again, that's significant for who Jesus is. This is God's presence breaking in, God speaking to his people. Therefore, for Mark, if I'm writing about this Jesus, I'm writing about the things that God has said and done amongst his people. So it's natural. It should look scriptural.
Yeah.
Just in the first sentence, they go into Capernaum, and on the Sabbath, again, Jesus' observance. So I don't know whether we ought to just note something about Capernaum and the particular context there.
Yes, I mean, we know from the other Gospels that Jesus made his home in Capernaum. It's not mentioned in Mark explicitly, though the beginning of chapter 2 kind of probably might imply it. But it's a town to the north of the Sea of Galilee, right on the northern coast of the Sea of Galilee,
on the northwest side, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's particularly interesting because it's on a main trade route from the Mediterranean end through to Damascus, through Syria. So whatever Jesus is doing here is going to travel, isn't it? That's a fascinating thing. And of course, what we see this in Scripture quite a lot. That actually the Roman trade routes were part of the way in which the gospel was carried to in the first century. And here again, he's not doing it somewhere out of the way, but people would have encountered him in the synagogue, and then they'd gone on their way.
Well, it's interesting. I did something I hadn't really noticed, that there kind of is a bit of an inclusio in this passage, because at the end of the passage it says, that once his fame spread everywhere. Well, actually, that illustrates what you've said, that if these things are happening at a center of communication, then the news is going to spread.
Yes.
Also, a connection, isn't there, with Paul's strategy? Because again, in Acts, Paul focuses his work on these major centers, which are on trade routes. And again, I think the assumption is that, again, churches will be, when churches are established in these communities, are established in these main centers, then they'll be planted out to the surrounding area as well.
Yeah, and I mean, today big cities are still strategic places, aren't they? I mean, London is still a strategic place for the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting that the Sea of Galilee was known in the ancient world for the clearness of its water and the variety of its fish, which of course then becomes laden with theological significance, doesn't it? As the gospel goes on, and of course Jesus equating the calling of disciples with the activity of fishing. I don't know if there's anything else. Oh, of course, if you've been to Capernaum, you'll see the synagogue there.
Yeah, there is the synagogue. Yeah.
There is, but that isn't the synagogue that Jesus did this in, because that's a 5th century one. Although if you look carefully, you can see basalt foundations.
Yeah,
which I think in the limestone 5th century one built on top, I think that is the footprint, of the 1st century synagogue. So that's intriguing.
Yeah.
And the Roman Catholics built a spaceship on top of Peter's house, which
that's right. Yes, the spaceship, the Starship Enterprise, or the Millennium Falcon. I think it's probably more like just for us, just for our sci-fi fans.
There we go. Okay, well, let's dive back into the passage here because time is racing on. And again, another thing to note about Mark's style, which I think has huge theological significance in the narrative, is this intercalation, or the weaving together of two stories, because he goes into the synagogue and was teaching. Now, that's really interesting in itself, isn't it? This is Jesus' habit, is to go in and to teach. And of course, in the first century, if you had a local celebrity, a traveling person who comes to the synagogue, the natural thing you do is you invite them and to say, you know, do you have a word for us? And they're astonished at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority. And then, interesting, he's then disrupted by this man who comes in with an unclean spirit. We'll go on to that, look at that language in a minute. But my observation is that the passage, the pericope, this section here, comes back to, in verse 27, the teaching. So you have teaching, well, not till the content of it, not until chapter 4. Then you have the deliverance ministry, and then they have a reference to the teaching again, which seems very significant to me.
Yes, it does. And I mean, Mark uses this device all the way through his gospel. I mean, he's famous for it. And always he uses it so that one piece of the sandwich, as it were, informs the other piece of the sandwich. So it helps. It's a device that helps us to understand what's going on. And I think here, of course, a very obvious conclusion to draw is this teaching is authoritative. It has power. Jesus' word is deed. I mean, essentially, I mean, that's what it kind of brings together very, very closely. It's the ultimate authenticity of the person, and it's perhaps something that we all strive for authenticity as people. Jesus excels in this. He really is who he says he is.
And it's just very striking. Although Mark doesn't tell us the content of the teaching, the priority is that Jesus comes as teacher. And this, I can't help relating this to contemporary discussions. I'm not going to mention the subject, but this idea that doctrine doesn't matter. Well, it's about who Jesus is and about the effect he has on us. And I said, well, hang on a second. Well, when you look in the Gospels, number one, Jesus is constantly teaching. Number two, what's really interesting is that when people want something from him, the outsiders or those who need healing, they actually consistently address him as teacher.
That is quite.
And that's actually across all the Gospels.
And
the other thing I'm really struck by, again, later on in Mark 6, and it's really striking that Mark does this because he doesn't, unlike Matthew and Luke and John, actually, fourth Gospel, he doesn't give us much of the content of Jesus' teaching. But Mark 6:34, he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Therefore, he
taught them.
So for Jesus as the good shepherd of Israel, what does a shepherd do? He feeds his sheep. How does Jesus feed the sheep? He teaches them. But yet, of course, Mark won't allow us to separate that from his actions in deliverance as well.
And of course, Jesus' teaching was interpreting people's lives for them in the light of what the God of Israel has done, the Creator God in Jesus himself, but in history as well, isn't he? I mean, that's the role of the teacher of the church today. It has to be fundamental.
So you're bringing biblical vocabulary to help people to understand their world they're in, what God is doing in that world, and therefore how they respond to that, how they live out and their response to God's actions and initiative. We ought to just comment before we moved on this. He taught them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. Again, just looking at different translations, do they consistently? Okay, interestingly, the TNIV actually changes this term for us to help us understand it. So he actually says, not as teachers of the law. So although it uses the word scribe here, we normally think of scribes as people who are copyists, copy out text, but actually,
they're not that sense here, isn't it? And I think in this time of the first century, I mean, the scribes were, the premier teachers within a synagogue setting. They were highly revered. It was the best teaching you could get, and Jesus outperforms, as it were, what they did. They were considered, to be hugely erudite.
And interesting, this word authority comes back. By the way, just in Acts 4:13, the Peter and John were noted that they were not scribes; they were agrammatoi. So that's not that they're not learned or they're ignorant. It's just they're not formally trained or they're not recognized as being trained. And actually, you know, Jesus is similar. He's not formally a rabbi. He's not formally a scribe, and yet his teaching has this authority about it, and there's power in it.
Yeah.
And here we go, Caiuthus again, and immediately.
Yes. Yes.
Now, this is a fascinating little detail here, isn't it? This is why we need to slow down and read these passages really carefully. And immediately there was in their synagogue.
Yes.
Isn't that a fascinating little detail?
I do think it is, because it just distances Jesus. It's not his synagogue, it's their synagogue. And I think consistently in Mark, the synagogue is the place of conflict for Jesus. I mean, he has conflict with demonic forces, he has conflict with leaders, he has conflict with people's hardness of heart, and he's persecuted, and all those things. So this is a contested space, and so the language of their synagogue absolutely makes sense in those terms, I think. Yeah,
that's a really fascinating observation. And again, we might want to be cautiously connecting with what's going on at the moment in England and the churches generally, but that is fascinating, isn't it? When you said that to me, I was very struck by it. It's actually when there's a mission to be done, when there's people to be reached, when there's a gospel, good news to be proclaimed, the forces of opposition come, and the conflict happens actually right amongst the people of God themselves, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Curious that Mark uses this language of unclean spirit. I think the other gospels tend to use more language of demon possession. Possessed. Although this is distinctive. And the other thing that's really striking about it, if you just look up the term, really interesting that this conflict is happening in Jesus' ministry mostly in the first half.
Yes.
I mean, this is Mark's gospel is a gospel in two halves, isn't it? Hinging around the confession in chapter 8 at Caesarea Philippi. So we actually get the mention of unclean spirit in Mark 3 twice, Mark 5, Mark 3 times, Mark 6, Mark 7, Mark 9, so one in the second half, but then after that it disappears. So there is definitely there's this focus on this powerful ministry involving conflict in the first half of the gospel.
Yeah.
And then it's the demon or the demon possessed man who initiates the conversation. And this is just a fascinating, there's several fascinating things about what he says. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Now, first of all, this phrase, what have you to do with us? So you get the plural there, which you also get when in religion. But it's a really unusual phrase, isn't it? Literally, what is it to you and to me?
Yes.
Which I think is an Old Testament phrase.
Right. Okay. And it really saying we don't have anything. We shouldn't be having anything to do with one another.
You haven't got the Old Testament references in front of you, have you?
No, I haven't. No. But
okay.
What it really means is I'd rather you went away.
It is, yeah. It's found
in like stronger language.
It's found in Judges, 2 Samuel. It's found in 1 Kings.
Okay, have you got some good references?
I'm cheating. I've got the list in front of me. So
there
we go.
Okay.
But here's the other thing. This is also the phrase Jesus uses to
his mother,
of course, in Cana,
in John 2.
Which is amazing. Actually, shows how strong his rebuke to her is. So
yes.
But here's the other thing: the title of Jesus as the Holy One of God.
Yeah, that's
only found here and in the parallel passage in Luke. That's the only time Jesus is addressed as the Holy One of God.
Yeah, but once again, it has that has possible references to the Old Testament. I mean, I think one of the things that I've seen is the reference to Samson, who is a Nazarite.
Where did you find that? Because you've been looking at another interesting comment.
Yeah, so that is in James Edwards mentions it in his commentary on Mark. This one, the pillar series. Yeah, there's 2 big pillars on the front. And in Judges, Samson is described as a Nazarite of God, so a holy one, a person set apart for God. And this is when he's before he loses his power. So he's strong. He's a strong man in the Lord. And he's able to destroy the Philistines through the power that is given to him in his head, his hair. So it's a supernatural power over the embodiment of evil in his time, which I think is a very interesting parallel here. And of course, the word Nazarite comes from the Hebrew nezer, which is also the root of the word Nazareth. And Nazareth is also mentioned here in this comment from the unclean spirit.
Oh, you're Jesus of Nazareth. Yes, it is connected, isn't it?
So it's all right close together. So it's very interesting that.
And again, the sort of, now we need to do a bit of homework on this. The idea that people have proposed that Nazareth itself was a center of fervent religious expectation about the coming one, precisely because of that kind of language. And of course, Matthew makes that connection. He shall be called a Nazarite. And that's what he moved. That's his theological account of why it is that Joseph and Mary settle in.
So he makes the connection explicit, which we're saying is implicit here, really.
But also, if there is a parallel with Samson, again, it's another element of this thing about authority, conflict, a power dynamic in Jesus' ministry. Interestingly, just recently I was reading in Revelation 5, where, who is worthy to open the scrolls? The line of the tribe of Judah, who then when John looks at him, it's Jesus, it's the Lamb looking as though he's been slain, with throat cut and blood everywhere, but standing, because he has conquered. Again, this idea of conquering the forces of darkness. So this is all part of this sort of Christus Victor idea of who Jesus is and what he's accomplished in his ministry, and then also his death and resurrection. I'm very struck by the fact that although extraordinary things happen, the unclean spirit convulsed him and crying out with a loud voice came out of him. There is something startling and striking happening, but Jesus is not doing a kind of circus performance thing on the one hand. No. On the other hand, and we know this is a contrast from other texts in the first century, there's no kind of recitation of a magic formula or anything special. It's simply a word of command. It just simply says Jesus rebuked him. I mean, in a sense, what Jesus does draws no attention to itself other than the effect that it has.
No, I mean, he doesn't even pray a prayer.
No, that's true.
No, his authority rests on himself.
Yeah.
And I mean, if people have kind of images of exorcism or whatever in their minds, they all the sort of Hollywood portrayals of it is incredibly messy.
Yes.
But Jesus is absolutely in total contrast to that. Fascinating that. And I suppose the very obvious answer to the demonic question, have you come to destroy us? Yes, I have actually.
Yes.
Which is completely articulated in the action rather than in anything. Jesus doesn't feel the need to say anything other than be silent and come out of him.
Now, just at that point, just before we finish, I'd love to share. I love the artist James Tissot, who was a French Catholic, and he came to the UK and had a kind of extraordinary spiritual experience and renewal. And then he went out to the area, to Israel, and he painted a whole series of pictures of Jesus' life. He did a series on the Old Testament, and he did a series of Jesus' ministry and life. And just have I got the right image? Yes. Can you see that? Does that look?
I can't see anything just yet.
Oh.
Maybe there's a technical hitch.
Can you see it now?
No.
Okay. Maybe I need to do this. Okay. Sorry, folks, for this little technical hitch here.
He painted a picture of a synagogue, basically, this chap, didn't he?
Did. Can you see that now?
No.
Oh, a screen share. It says it tells me I'm sharing the screen.
Maybe. Oh, I can see it now. Yeah, I can see it.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there's a couple of things here which I think are wrong. So firstly, he's got lots of wooden furniture, which probably wouldn't have had because wood was really scarce in the first century.
Yeah.
And the second thing, which is really slightly bizarre, is he's got this whip and the man is carrying. Now, I think literally that's wrong, but I wonder if he's capturing that sense of conflict, and because of course Jesus used the whip to drive out to cleanse the temple. So there's a sense, I wonder if Tissot is saying here, look, here's a man who's potentially a temple of the Holy Spirit, and Jesus is cleansing the man in the way that he cleansed the temple. That just occurred to me, actually, just a second looking at it.
Yeah, no, it does look like it. If when you see it, you think of Jesus cleansing the temple. That's the thing you immediately think about. And he's drawing those things to our attention together, isn't he? The artist. So fascinating, yeah.
But what I love about it is the expressions on the face of all.
The people behind, all kinds of different expressions, aren't there?
They are, yeah. And actually, Mark uses two words. He uses thaumazo, as in amazed at the wonders, but also another verb, ekplesso, which is just again distinctive to Mark, but he uses it repeatedly about the impact that Jesus' ministry and teaching has on people. And interestingly, that in this episode, people are astonished at his teaching and they're astonished at his actions, and then they're astonished at the whole package. So again,
yeah,
it does capture that sense.
yeah, yeah. And unlike in other situations of demonic possession, we're not told anything about the man, particularly not like the story of Legion, for instance, because the emphasis here is on the ministry of Jesus, or, on the identity of Jesus, actually, rather than particularly the effect of the ministry, I think. So, yeah.
Mm. And fascinating that they questioned amongst themselves, saying, "Who is this? And you teach him with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits." So again, reinforcing that from the sandwich thing that he does, that the teaching and the deliverance belong together.
Yeah.
And one thing that I think is fascinating to note here is that the debate amongst the people: who is this? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? It actually anticipates the division of those who are going to accept Jesus and his claims, and those who, like the unclean spirit, are going to see his authority as a threat.
Yeah.
In fact, the language of the unclean spirit almost anticipates the opposition amongst the people themselves as to whether they'll accept his ministry.
Yeah.
What a fascinating passage.
Yeah.
James, thank you very much for reflecting reflecting with me on it. Friends, I hope that's been useful, and I hope you enjoy exploring this for yourselves and preaching on it, or listening to other people preaching on it and following it up. Maybe one of the things we do in our church at the moment is we follow up in small groups, saying, okay, what does this mean for us? How do we apply it in our lives as well, so that we can really continue to explore this? And James, just a final reminder, what people need to do, those 4 things.
Yeah, do subscribe to the channel, do like the videos, do share on the social media, and do comment.
Great. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.